So today I'll be presenting my talk entitled Designing for Online Safety Towards More Equitable and Trustworthy Systems. But before I dive in, just a bit about myself, since this is my first time speaking to everyone here. I've been really grateful throughout my time as a PhD student to have the opportunity to be funded by Facebook, Google. I've also received funding from a nonprofit serving Latin America and the Caribbean region called FRIDA. In terms of internships, I've worked with like IBM, Max Planck, Norton as well. And I've been also recognized by the United Nations as a trailblazer for the work I've been doing in the Caribbean. Well, I'll jump in. So throughout my time as a researcher, I have largely been focused on answering this particular question. How can we build technology that is safe with the caveat that people could actually use it and understand it? Now, answering this question has become more and more important as we've seen more algorithmic systems being embedded in everything that we interact with. But likewise, we also seen the entangled nature of its abuses as well. So these harms, they seem to have a social life. They travel throughout all our social institutions, and they extend well beyond the boundaries of technical systems. And there's been a lot of work making considerable strides towards making systems work in a way that is fair, but is that really enough? Like if we focus solely on the technical parts, are we as researchers actually widening inequalities by ignoring potential social injustices or not necessarily considering different populations of persons who may be disproportionately affected? Now, to address a lot of these things, researchers have looked at answering the problem with technology, with more technology, kind of leading to problems around technology solutionism. And when these countermeasures are presented to persons, most times people get like the same one-size-fits-all approach, like everyone gets the same thing. Ignoring that different people might need additional resources to actually counteract the effects of all of these abuses that happen with algorithmic systems, which kind of leads us into a direction where we need like more reflection regarding whether or not we should have more of an equality focus or more so leaning towards or at least acknowledging equity. Moreover to this, we see a lot of imbalance when it comes to who exactly designs and pushes solutions for the community. So now we're seeing new directions, especially within the field of HCI and social computing, where researchers are really challenging this status quo. So now we're seeing persons considering who gets to participate in the design process, reshifting the imbalances between what populations are considered, what populations are studied, what populations are served, and the researchers themselves, like making sure that the backgrounds are diverse and we get a good understanding of different persons' needs. And this becomes an important, and I'll introduce you to someone so I could kind of highlight why this should be considered. So this is Jason. Jason is an activist in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a country in the Caribbean. He's an activist for the LGBTQ community. He's been making strides, actually trying to challenge the government on some of the laws that they have that are particularly harmful to that particular community. Now, when he started this petition to challenge the government, he was faced with a lot of threats. So the threats started in the digital realm, people sending him threats on Facebook, which quickly gravitated to being a threat for his physical safety, not just for him, but also for his roommate. So he ended up needed to relocate physically for his safety and for the safety of his roommate. But this highlights that when we look at safety and safety perceptions, it's not just thinking about how safety could be done online, but acknowledging that this could really have like a domino effect for persons, especially in small knit communities where things could escalate very quickly, not just for persons, but the harm could be more collective, extending to their network as well. So then a lot of my work, particularly for my dissertation, has been trying to focus on this particular objective. So looking at a very holistic way of designing and supporting tools that acknowledge individual differences, legislative constraints, and social injustice. So today I'll be primarily focusing on the results of a study that just was published in CHI, which answers this primary question. So how do Caribbean people in general perceive, evaluate, and mitigate online risks? We shift to this particular population since there has hardly ever been any literature available for this particular population. And it's important to include voices that may feel invisible, but also considering that this particular population, they're at a very interesting point where they're trying to craft legislation to be able to fight or address these types of harms. So we did some work primarily connecting with persons on the ground, working with a nonprofit there to be able to conduct this work in a way that is respectful and responsible. All right, so we want to be able to understand how people perceive, evaluate, and mitigate risks. In order to do this, we adopted the protection motivation theory. Now, at a very high level, this theory suggests that people's prior experiences has a direct relationship with how they, one, evaluate risks, but also how they mitigate potential risks and future risks as well. And this is a big model, and if you're not necessarily familiar with like structural equation modeling, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I'll break it down a bit. So first we have one of the first components, which is threat appraisals. Now to break this down a bit, this pretty much says that people evaluate threats by considering the extent of their vulnerability and severity of the risk to answer the question of whether or not they should be worried about like a particular threat. Similarly, we have persons coping appraisal. So here people consider whether the safety tools themselves can help them to take effective action to protect themselves. So we combine these things and to see like how this interacts with people's behavioral intention to actually adopt safety tools. So this helps us in general to understand which safety tools people perceive to be most effective and not, especially when it comes to particular types of harms. And in considering the type of harms, we look at a very comprehensive view of algorithmic systems, looking more so at the input side, also the output, and more so system level interactions. And I'll break this down. So we look at actions related to persons' access and disclosure. So what information is normally processed, collected, or disclosed. Abusive behaviors that might be considered as harassment. Threats related to your security, related to your account, credentials, things of that nature. And also more so like post-digital or online to offline threats. So threats that may have started in an online space, but quickly translated over to like the real world, like we saw with Jason. So to conduct this work, we considered deploying a large-scale online survey. So the sample size in the end was 551 persons from over 9 Caribbean countries. We opted to work with a nonprofit on the ground to be able to look at what's the most effective way of recruiting persons, also doing it in a respectable way, because there were some questions that had to be altered. So it's just respectable to culture. We also followed up with expert interviews or interviews with experts throughout the region to help to better contextualize the results. So here is what we found. Unsurprisingly, the majority of participants reported having experienced a threat to their online safety. The 92% of participants had an experience that threatened their online safety. So this is across all of the different categories. Now, more specifically, we found that the top 3 threats that people experience were actually all from different dimensions of safety. In particular, the most prevalent threats were related to unwanted or shady targeted advertising practices, unsolicited content, and compromised login information. Now, in terms of how persons evaluate and address these type of threats, we found that trust actually plays an important role in adopting protective behaviors. But this was particularly important when it came to harassment-related threats. So here we see that regardless to how severe a threat was, how much someone trusted a platform significantly influenced how much they were willing to even consider online safety tools. Now, this is particularly important for just developers in general, because let's say that you're developing tools. It's important to consider that how much persons trust or perceive your platform to be trustworthy is something that you should be able to consider. Otherwise, you'll be placing like a lot of effort into building countermeasures that no one would probably use. Now, to recap, we saw that trust is plays an important role in adaptive protective behaviors. And this is particularly important when it came to harassment-related threats. And interestingly, we also saw that persons were more willing to adopt digital safety tools that affect their digital safety versus threats that affect them in offline contexts. So for instance, if your password on Facebook got stolen, you were more likely to interact with a safety tool to address that particular harm versus if you got discriminated against like by an ad or something like that that robbed you of an opportunity and that affected your ability to get a job in real life. Options that were there online for you, persons were less likely to engage with those. So in this study, we learned that recovery in small knit communities is not easy. Oftentimes, the consequences of these threats spill over to the real world, affecting people, their families, and their ability to maintain jobs. So after knowing this, where do we go next? So the results have implications for multiple stakeholders. People are still experiencing high incident rates, and for designers, this could mean rethinking control options and making sure that they take action, people are able to take action when they need to, and that they actually understand like how to do that. Lastly, it is equally important to deeply think about how people search for justice outside of the platform so that we could consider how policy and legislation could better inform how we actually roll out safety mechanisms. taken all together, the hope is that we could start including more forgotten voices as we try to make sure that the internet could be a safer place for all. That would be, I'll pause here. But I want to take a special time out to thank all the people, especially persons who were on the ground in the Caribbean, making this possible. Right now, we are working to actually integrate the findings of this work to make sure that this could inform legislation. So I think this is an important direction for us as researchers to consider, not just for the possibility of contributing to the community in terms of publications and like pushing knowledge forward, but also integrating like how findings could help one to better inform the public in themselves, so they could have an opportunity to let people know what they're experiencing and how those could best be mitigated, and making sure everyone could understand that, like even down to your grandmother. But also like taking those same insights and incorporating them in a way that they could also help these people and provide like better protections, both that could inform policy, but also that could help to better integrate countermeasures that are in the digital space as well. So seeing safety more so from like a very collective harm and very collective position. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.